The Archive of Longing. What is this strange thing that we call religion? Etymologically, of course, it is a binding together, but bound together in pursuit of what? And with whom? These are essential questions. It seems we're bound together in pursuit of the enduring, the sublime, of our higher selves. We seek that which inspires awe, reverence, wonder, right action, the numinous truth of interdependence, and above all, love. That great cosmic gift that our rabbis teach might well be the meaning of life. And with whom are we gathered today? The foundation of Unitarian Universalism is an exquisite covenant of 7 values. The central value is love. The other 6, interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice. These, then, are the people with whom we gather today. You who choose these principles as a binding agent, who aspire to build your character by the light of these values. Whatever other beliefs you might have, whatever traditions or cultures raised you, and to which you elect affinities, you invite anyone who shares these aspirations into your kin community. Thank you for your splendid hospitality. I am a rabbi in the Hefker Apikoros tradition, and a book rabbi at that, one whose ministry centers the book and who serves not the people of the book, but the people of the books. Late last year, 2 polydox rabbis and a visionary author established something called a Hefker House of Wisdom, a religious institution whose central binding agent is the thoughtfully assembled book sanctuary and the browsing and reading in community such spaces hold. I look forward to sharing more about this and how a house of wisdom might provide communities with a reserve of resilience. But first, I'd like to speak a bit to my rabbinate, which, as is likely already clear, is decidedly idiosyncratic. I come from an Orthodox Jewish background, one I left 37 years ago, just after I was bar mitzvahed in the traditional Orthodox manner. Rabbinic Judaism teaches that Jews are a chosen people, chosen to bear the burden of righteousness for humanity, to follow the commandments, do mitzvahs, good deeds. But my rabbis teach that this is an idolatry, the idea of chosen people chosen by birthright. They teach that it is only the self-chosen who bear the burden of humanity, and that we can all choose to bear our share of the weight, as you have done by choosing to live by those 7 values, thereby lightening the weight of all. In pursuit of this calling, our provenance is a matter of difference and a matter of indifference, both of which matter greatly. In addition, my rabbis teach that orthodoxy is heresy and heterodoxy is holy, as all paths to awakening, to spiritual actualization are single use. The pluralism which you celebrate as one of your core covenants we name as polydoxy. The principles of pluralism and polydoxy are nearly identical. My rabbis teach that we must assemble our own Torahs, build our own sacred canons, and the building of community around our shared search for diverse sources of meaning, wonder, and awe is a spiritual imperative. It is not incidental that 2 of the 3 founders of the House of Wisdom are rabbis, and 2 of the 3 are authors, we keepers of a religion of the book. The title rabbi means simply teacher. Who is wise, Ben Zoma asked in the Talmud? One who learns from every person. Who are the best teachers but the great and perpetual students, the keepers of curiosity, those lit by the spark of engagement and dialogue? The learning ones, not those who deem themselves learned. There is no finish line in matters of spiritual, intellectual, and emotional growth, which the Unitarian Universalist value of transformation articulates elegantly as never complete and never perfect. Nouns are idols. Only verbs can speak to the truly divine. A good rabbi is an astute listener and a keen reader, a tireless excavator of wisdom and love. As was taught by my chief Rebbe, Walt Whitman, the holy rabbi is meant to gather the wisdom out of the minds of those they meet on the road, to gather the love out of their hearts, that the mitzvahs, the good deeds of their assemblage, by dint of sharing with others, continue to multiply. The holy Whitmanian rabbi, like a bookish, pious, and loving-kind Johnny Appleseed, scatters these seeds of wisdom generously, knowing that even a seed that fails to germinate feeds the world. Rabbis never teach their own wisdom directly, but they either share the wisdom of others or credit their rabbis with creating an insight that they articulate on behalf of the one who planted the seed. This isn't a conceit. The true rabbi is humble, understanding the grace of wisdom, of love, of life. How can they claim such unearned wisdom as their own? Wisdom is Hefker, a Talmudic legal concept that means unowned, public, common. Hefker, like water or the wind. And like water and the wind, it cannot be stilled. Wisdom, like truth, love, and life, only persists in circulation. Wisdom can't be possessed, only beheld and understood. If we choose to seek it, contemplate it, and are lucky to behold and understand it, even if only for a time, might we act from its wise place. What we create when we are close to our wisdom is always a divine creation, and all divine creations are Hefker, including us. And so I'm a book rabbi, a guardian of a house of wisdom where we aspire to be as Hefker as the wisdom contained in the collection, a disciple of the house of wisdom, an Epicurean in the Talmudic sense. The Talmudic epithet apikores is a harsh and powerful word that was used to brand heretics. It's likely a straight transliteration of Epicurus, that maverick who posted a welcome and an ethos above the entrance to his school called the Garden, which read in full, "Stranger, here you will do well to tarry. Here our greatest good is pleasure." What is the pleasure that the original apikores celebrated above all? The absence of pain in the body and trouble in the soul. Our Bes Chachma, our house of wisdom, is focused on the latter, bringing peace to the troubled world. Hefker and apikores share a root, the Hebrew letters Pei, Kuf, Resh, which means to set free. You know what else shares a root? The Latin words for book and freedom. Libraries, those Hefker institutions, even etymologically liberate. The House of Wisdom is a religious institution. It celebrates a binding together of a different order. The bound books bind a community together through their shared pursuit of unbound wisdom. It is a bookstore, library, reading room, where the temple is a place that renders the invisible workings of the human spirit visible across the spines and on the pages bound by the book's covers. The House of Wisdom is a heterodox affair. In a literal way, it is also a heretical affair, an apikores endeavor. The word heretic is based on the Greek word for choice, heresis. I believe in our singularity, our singular path towards wisdom. To discover our bespoke paths requires the freedom, Pei, Kuf, Resh, to choose, heresis, from the broadest array of possible ways forward. To assemble our Torahs, our own Bibles, our own liturgies, our own Psalms, and Lamentations. And so the House of Wisdom will collect books that consider wisdom, insight, beauty, awe, suffering, reverence, grief, devotion, and the good life from as many different perspectives as possible, hoping to support you and our communities in assembling our own personal canons. In this way, it is an institution that believes in our longing for divine truth and in our pursuit of meaning, acknowledging that we are never perfect, never complete. but that ours is a great asymptotic affair, our longing for a promised land we will never reach, for a return to Eden, for the perfection of our souls and the soul of the world, the perfection of love. The sought after is itself the most divine act of which we are capable. I suspect these are Universalist tendencies, those which one of the most esteemed Unitarian heretics spoke to beautifully nearly 2 centuries ago, in 1836 in his journal. Rabbi Ralph Waldo Emerson, rabbi to us all, wrote to himself, "Make your own Bible. Select and collect all these words and sentences that in your reading have been to you like the blast of a trumpet." And these are the testimonies that give our lives meaning. And the browsing of these testimonies in the repositories of longing is a great act of devotion, of worship, reliable mechanisms for the development of our resilience. Susan Sontag called her library an archive of longings. John O'Donohue once wrote, "Longing is the presence of the divine." We Hefker Apikoros rabbis assemble those archives into Epicurean gardens, knowing the fertility of the soil of our seeking. From Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. Thomas Merton wrote, "There is always a temptation to diddle around in the contemplative life, making itsy-bitsy statues. There's always an enormous temptation in all of life to diddle around, making itsy-bitsy friends and meals and journeys for itsy-bitsy years on end. It is so self-conscious, so apparently moral, simply to step aside from the gaps where the creeks and winds pour down, saying, 'I never merited this grace,' quite rightly, and then to sulk along the rest of your days on the edge of rage. I won't have it. The world is wilder than that in all directions, more dangerous and bitter, more extravagant and bright. We are making hay when we should be making whoopee. We are raising tomatoes when we should be raising Cain or Lazarus. Ezekiel excoriates false prophets as those who have not gone up into the gaps. The gaps are the thing. The gaps are the Spirit's one home, the altitudes and latitudes so dazzlingly spare and clean that the Spirit can discover itself for the first time, like a once blind man unbound. The gaps are the cliffs in the rock where you cower to see the back parts of God. They are the fissures between mountains and cells the wind lances through, the icy narrowing fjords splitting the cliffs of mystery. Go up into the gaps, if you can find them. They shift and vanish too. Stalk the gaps. Squeak into a gap in the soil, turn and unlock more than a maple, a universe. This is how you spend this afternoon and tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon. Spend the afternoon. You can't take it with you. I live in tranquility and trembling. Sometimes I dream. I am interested in Alice mainly when she eats the cookie that makes her smaller. I would pair myself or be paired that I too might pass through the merest crack, a gap I know is there in the sky. I am looking just now for the cookie. Sometimes I open pride like a fruit, or I am porous as old bone, or translucent, a tinted condensation of the air like a watercolor wash, and I gaze around me in bewilderment, fancying I cast no shadow. Sometimes I ride a bucking faith while one hand grips and the other flails the air, and like any daredevil, I gouge with my heels for blood, for a wilder ride, for more. There is not a guarantee in the world. Oh, your needs are guaranteed. Your needs are absolutely guaranteed by the most stringent of warranties in the plainest, truest words. Knock, seek, ask. But you must read the fine print. Not as the world giveth, give I unto you. That's the catch. If you can catch it, it will catch you up, aloft, up to any gap at all, and you'll come back, for you will come back, transformed in a way you may not have bargained for, dribbling and crazed. The waters of separation, however lightly sprinkled, leave indelible stains. Did you think before you were caught that you needed, say, life? Do you think you will keep your life or anything else you love? But no, your needs are all met, but not as the world giveth. You see the needs of your own spirit met whenever you have asked, and you have learned that the outrageous guarantee holds. You see the creatures die, and you know you will die. And one day it occurs to you that you must not need life. Obviously. And then you're gone. You have finally understood that you're dealing with a maniac. I think that the dying pray at the last, not please, but thank you, as a guest thanks his host at the door. Falling from airplanes, the people are crying, thank you, all down the air, and the cold carriages draw up for them on the rocks. Divinity is not playful. The universe was not made in jest, but in solemn, incomprehensible earnest, by a power that is unfathomably secret and holy and fleet. There's nothing to be done about it, but ignore it or see. And then you walk fearlessly, eating what you must, growing wherever you can, like the monk on the road who knows precisely how vulnerable he is, who takes no comfort among death-forgetting men, and who carries his vision of vastness and might around in his tunic, like a live coal which neither burns nor warms him, but with which he will not part. The architecture of reverence. The question of resilience that Gail posed and that you are considering this month is so compelling. How do we find resilience, especially in impossible times? It is only false nostalgia or our privilege that lead us to consider these to be particularly impossible times, impossible though they might seem. And that we have had resilience in prior impossible times doesn't guarantee us the confidence that our resilience will provide us enough strength, serenity, or wisdom to endure with our buoyancy and benevolence intact. I'd like to return to the Unitarian Universalist bylaws, which I am particularly fond of. This is section C, which holds forth on inspirations. It reads in full. Direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder are primary sources of Unitarian Universalist inspiration. These experiences open our hearts, renew our spirits, and transform our lives. We draw upon and are inspired by sacred, secular, and scientific understandings that help us make meaning and live into our values. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which these sources were created and are currently practiced. Grateful for the experiences that move us, aware of the religious ancestries we inherit, and enlivened by the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. Wisdom passes through us, but we cannot hold it. Wisdom has passed through so many, and a select few any given year record their insight in books of wisdom. These are humanity's gift to humanity, these records of experiences of wonder, awe, strangeness, grandeur, of the encounter with suffering or the ineffable, and the insights and codes discovered then. Some rabbis teach that all religion is rooted in these moments, and that their rarity and ephemerality lead us to forget, and that forgetting leads us to folly. But for those who find ways to replenish their memory with the numinous certainty those moments inspire, who maintain loyalty to these instances of insight, diffuse their vision throughout the less enlightened hours of their lives. My rabbis call this becoming identical with one's wisdom, which is the wisdom of the ages that crystallizes in our singular lives. For so many of us, the concentrate of wisdom is found in books: contemplation, submission to artful prose, the evocative and almost intelligence-resisting fulcrum of poetry, and that the finest tool for achieving such self-identity, which is as close to God identity as we can get, what Uchiyama Roshi calls the self that fills the whole universe, specifically are sacred canons, perhaps overlapping but unique to each individual. I'd like to propose that a storehouse of wisdom books, an assemblage of testimonies to these moments of insight, what Virginia Woolf called moments of being, not just ours, but those of others throughout time and across geographies, the assemblage and then the act of contemplation among these testimonies, whether in solitude or community, can replenish our memories with illustrations of meaning drawn from communion with the ineffable. For the last 9 months, I've lived as a contemplative resident at the Upaya Zen Center up on Cerro Gordo Road. It was the first time in nearly 40 years that I lived in a community predicated upon reverence, where our lifestyle and nearly every hour of the day was devoted to a shared endeavor of increasing intimacy with what deemed the highest truth. The word contemplative, which means to gaze attentively, observe, consider, contemplate, comes from the Greek for calm and templum, for being with or beside the temple, a space limbed for discerning the ways of the gods. The Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein famously said that the mystical is not how the world is, but that it is. And to wonder at that what is, the majesty of creation's perpetual creation, the flow from the source at the issuance, as manifest in the great mystery of the poetry of consciousness, is itself an act of reverence. I had the privilege of hearing archaeoastronomer Alonso Mendez lecture at Upaya. He spoke of sacred architecture and how the Mayans built their temples that they might capture and reveal the sun, building that we might perceive what we would otherwise miss without those frames, those doors, those windows, those angles. He enthused about the Temple of the Sun at Palenque, which was built to capture the lunar standstill, or lunistis, the moon's version of a solstice, which is a phenomenon that occurs every 18 or so years. He enthused about the temple of the feathered serpent deity, where in the late afternoon of the equinox, a triangular shadow cast against the railing is said to resemble a serpent slithering down the steps. These temples were meant to mark time to assist with agricultural decisions, while also evoking the divine in the great mysteries of the revolution of the celestial bodies. Sacred architecture reveals the truth of what is, the mystical, centering the generation of revelations of our divinity in the worlds by framing it. And so it is with books and the sanctuaries that house a thoughtful collection, be they libraries, bookstores, reading rooms. This is where a religious institution of a related sort might be helpful, one which I and the co-founders of a Hefker House of Wisdom are looking to realize here in Santa Fe. Sacred spaces suspend the ordinary measures of time, providing a spaciousness marked not by emptiness, but by boundlessness. The portals of these houses of worship serve as thresholds, their crossings an invitation to venture into the depths of meaning, understanding, and wisdom. Imagine with me a house of wisdom, a book sanctuary predicated upon sacred reading, sacred browsing, and the assembling of individual canons, of our own personal Bibles that might create just this sort of imaginative landscape. The House of Wisdom would venerate the act of browsing, maintain a reverence for rumination that is at once illuminating and tender, where simply being in the presence of books is itself an act of reverence, an offering of time and attention akin to prayer. The browser wouldn't merely seek answers, but would deepen their delight in asking more beautiful questions. To browse the shelves of the House of Wisdom, one would embark on a pilgrimage where curiosity is guided by care. Each book, deliberately chosen by book clergy for its accumulated insight, beauty, and power, would invite not just the book, not just the mind, but the heart and spirit to open. The gentle act of discovery while lingering over passages, savoring unhurried moments of contemplation, could remind us that understanding is a gift best received with humility and gratitude. Here, one might find recognition in the company of others who seek, and together, the search for truth might become a shared act of devotion. The community might gather not only to learn, but to worship in the cathedral of literature where books are vessels and the shelves serve as altars, not to infallible gods, but to fallible humanity, to assemblages of volumes meant to express the truth of us. In a Hefker House of Wisdom, the rhythms of browsing in the presence of books would be woven into the fabric of daily life, binding seekers together in a communion of reverence, purpose, and meaning. It would then be less an organization than a disposition, a dwelling shaped by profound longing where the architecture of thought is rendered visible, and the reader could encounter among the stacks the divine presence that animates all seeking and contemplation. The French poet Paul Valéry wrote that the past astonishes the present and that the work of years astounds the moment. Sensei Kathy Fisher taught that the future was created because the present isn't big enough to contain our awe. So the future serves as a receptacle for our boundless sense of wonder. We need repositories of moments of being, storehouses of resilience, that we might replenish our memories with arguments of piety. We need an architecture of reverence that captures the sun at its zenith, the moon at a standstill, and the shadows such heavenly positions cast on the ground beneath our feet. I knew even better, Valéry wrote, by my very certain experience that our souls can, in the very heart of time, make for themselves sanctuaries impenetrable to duration, eternal in their inner selves, and transient with regard to nature, when they at last are what they know, where they feel themselves to be created by what they love, and render back to it light for light and silence for silence, giving themselves and receiving themselves again without borrowing aught from the stuff the world is made of, nor from the hours. By dint of creating, Socrates said, I create myself. These sanctuaries we build become inner sanctuaries, until we ourselves become the sanctuaries we sought. We all have access to our bespoke houses of wisdom. We just need to build them. May we so build them together.